They stripped her of everything: her name, her dignity, her right to survive. But the one thing they forgot to take was the only thing that would destroy them all. A widow branded with her dead husband's sins, a town that chose a lie over justice, and one winter so savage it turned men into monsters. This is the story of Evelyn Harper, the woman everyone wanted gone, and the mountain man who bet his life she was worth saving. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Hit like stay until the end, because the woman they threw away is about to become the last thing Black Ridge ever forgot. The morning they decided to kill Evelyn Harper, not with a bullet, not with a rope, but with the cold, she was standing in front of Harlan Greer's dry goods store with her last 2 coins pressed so hard into her palm that the edges left marks she'd carry for days. She wasn't there to beg. She told herself that 3 times on the walk over, each step crunching through ice that had refrozen overnight into something mean and sharp. She was there to buy flour, half a pound, maybe less if Greer had jacked up his prices again, which he had a habit of doing whenever the mountain passes closed and no new supply wagons could get through, just enough to make something that resembled bread, something to get through another night. She pushed open the door. The bell above it rang, and every head in the store turned. There were 4 people inside: Martha Simmons with her basket hooked over one arm, the 2 Pruitt brothers killing time near the stove, and old Delbert Finch sitting on the stool he'd claimed as his personal property sometime around 1863. They all looked at her the same way. Not with anger, not right away. Just that flat, cold recognition that said you again before any of them opened their mouths. Harlan Greer looked up from behind the counter. He was a wide man with a face built for disappointment. Heavy brows, a jaw like a shelf. Eyes that didn't so much look at you as evaluate whether you were worth looking at. "We're closed," he said. Evelyn glanced around the clearly open store. The fire was going. The lamp was lit. Martha Simmons had a wedge of cheese sitting right there on the counter. "The sign says open," Evelyn said. "Sign's wrong." She stood there a moment, feeling the cold she'd brought in with her start to settle around her ankles. She'd learned over the past 3 months that there was a specific kind of silence that preceded cruelty in Black Ridge. It wasn't the silence of people holding their tongues. It was the silence of people deciding how much they were willing to say out loud. Martha Simmons turned away first, suddenly very interested in the bolts of fabric on the far wall. "Mr. Greer," Evelyn said, keeping her voice even, "I have money, 2 cents. I just need a little flour. I'm not asking for anything I haven't paid for." "Your money's no good here. It's legal tender." "Evelyn," he said her name like it tasted bad. "Your husband robbed the payroll of 6 good men. 2 of those men got families that are going hungry this winter because of what Thomas Harper did. You think I'm going to take your money and put it in the same till with theirs?" "Thomas is dead," she said. "He's been dead for 4 months. The damage ain't." One of the Pruitt brothers, the younger one, Walt, who couldn't have been more than 19 and had a mean streak that came from having nothing better to do with his time, shifted his weight and said, "Maybe she can ask her outlaw friends to feed her." The other one snickered. Evelyn looked at Walt Pruitt long enough that he glanced away, which she counted as a small victory and the only one she'd have all day. She turned back to Greer. "Half a pound of flour, 2 cents, that's all I'm asking." He picked up the cheese he'd set out for Martha Simmons and moved it behind the counter with the same deliberate slowness of a man who wanted you to understand exactly what he was doing and why. "Get out of my store," he said, "and don't come back." She walked home, if you could call it home, through streets that felt like they were made of spite and frozen mud. The cabin she'd been renting sat at the east end of town, tucked behind the livery stable, which meant she got the smell of horses and manure year-round and the sound of iron being worked at 4 in the morning when Pete Alderman decided to start his day. The cabin itself was barely adequate. 1 room, a fireplace that smoked more than it warmed, a door that didn't sit right in its frame and let in a whistle of wind no matter how many rags she stuffed into the gaps. She'd moved there after Thomas died, after the house they'd shared, the house she'd thought was partly hers, turned out to be in his name only, along with every debt he'd accumulated without telling her. She hadn't known about the robbery. She genuinely hadn't known, and for a while she'd believed that would matter. That someone in Black Ridge would look at her face and see that the shock was real, that the grief was real, that she had not been standing beside her husband counting stolen money while decent men went without their wages. No one had looked at her that way. What they'd seen was the wife. And in Black Ridge, the wife was close enough to guilty. She let herself into the cabin and stood for a moment in the dark before striking a match for the lamp. The light came up slow and yellow, catching the edges of the space, the narrow bed with its single blanket, the table with its one chair, the cold fireplace. The woodpile beside it held maybe 3 logs. Enough for tonight if she was careful, not enough for tomorrow. She sat down at the table and put her 2 coins on the surface and looked at them. The problem wasn't just food. The problem was everything. 3 months ago, when Thomas Harper had ridden into an ambush of his own making and taken a bullet in the chest, he'd left behind what amounted to a collection of disasters wrapped in a man's clothing. Debts to men she'd never met. A business arrangement with someone called Rourke that she still didn't fully understand. A reputation that had attached itself to her like a brand the moment the sheriff read the charges aloud in the town square. She'd tried to work. Ida Beaumont had let her wash laundry for 2 weeks before someone, she never found out who, told Ida that having Evelyn Harper on her property was going to be bad for business. The schoolteacher position she'd applied for had been turned down with a letter so polite it made her teeth ache. Even the brothel over on 2nd Street, which didn't have the luxury of being selective, had told her they weren't hiring. The 2 cents on the table had come from selling the last of her good hairpins to a woman passing through on the stage. She'd thought they might last her another week if she stretched them. Now they'd last her nothing, because Harlan Greer had decided that justice in Black Ridge meant punishing the widow for the sins of the man who'd left her. She put her head in her hands, not to cry. She was mostly past crying, which she'd decided meant either that she was getting stronger or that something in her had quietly broken off and drifted away. She wasn't sure which, and she'd stopped examining it too closely. She lifted her head. The lamp flickered in a draft from the window. Think, she told herself. You've got 3 logs and 2 cents and whatever's left in your head. Use it. The notice arrived the next morning, slipped under her door while it was still dark. She found it when she got up to add the second-to-last log to the fire, her bare feet on the cold floor, breath misting in front of her face. A folded piece of paper, and not a friendly one. She could tell by the weight of it, the official way it had been folded into thirds like something that thought highly of itself. She took it to the lamp. By order of the Black Ridge Town Council, Evelyn Harper, widow of Thomas R. Harper, outlaw, deceased, is hereby notified that her continued presence in this township has been deemed a disturbance to public order and a threat to the moral standing of the community. She is directed to vacate all premises within the township limits by sundown on this date, December 14th, 1878, and to not return. Failure to comply will result in forcible removal. Signed, Mayor Arthur Kane, Councilman J. Beaumont, H. Greer, T. Pruitt. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table beside the 2 coins and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. December 14th. Today. Sundown. She went to the window and looked out at the mountains that ringed Black Ridge on 3 sides like a closed fist. The peaks were white and hard under a sky the color of dirty pewter. The passes she knew of, the one south toward Redemption Creek, the one east toward the Halford Valley, had been closed since mid-November. 2 men had tried the southern pass 2 weeks ago, and one of them had come back alone, and he hadn't said much about what happened to the other one. They were telling her to walk into that. They were using the mountains to do what they couldn't do with a rope without having to answer for it later. She thought very clearly, they know. They knew the passes were closed. Harlan Greer knew, because he tracked supply wagons for a living. Arthur Kane knew because he'd been talking about it at the livery 2 days ago while she'd been walking past. She'd heard his voice floating out through the open doors, something about not expecting new stock until February. They all knew. This wasn't an eviction. This was a sentence. She spent an hour trying to think of someone who might help her. The list was short and depressing. Reverend Mills had made it quietly, but clearly understood that associating with her was not in the community's interest. Doc Haverford was a decent man, but had a wife who'd decided Evelyn was a corrupting influence, and the doctor had long since learned to pick his battles based on what he'd have to sleep next to that night. Clara Ames at the boarding house had slipped her a meal once, back in October, but Clara was widowed herself and couldn't afford to be on the wrong side of the council's favor. There was no one. She packed what she had, which didn't take long: a change of clothes, her husband's old hunting knife, the one thing of his she'd kept, not for sentiment, but because it was practical, her mother's small mirror with the cracked corner, and a wool scarf that had seen better days but still held some warmth. She rolled them into a blanket and tied it with a strip of leather. Then she sat down and waited. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Maybe for a better idea to present itself. Maybe for something to change. Maybe she just needed to sit in the only space that had been hers, even temporarily, even grudgingly, before she left it. The fire burned down. She didn't add the last log. By 2 in the afternoon, half of Black Ridge had apparently decided that watching Evelyn Harper leave was worth the cold. She stepped out of the cabin with her bundle and found them gathered, but not a mob, nothing so organized as that, but a loose congregation of people who'd found reasons to be near the east end of town at that particular hour. Martha Simmons with her ever-present basket. The Pruitt brothers, Walt grinning like this was entertainment. Old Finch sitting on a fence post. Some faces she recognized and some she didn't. A handful of children who'd been allowed to watch, which said something about what the adults of Black Ridge wanted the next generation to learn about justice. Harlan Greer stood near the front, his arms crossed, his expression that of a man who's successfully completed a transaction. Evelyn walked out into the cold and faced them. She'd thought about what to say. She'd run through several versions during the hours of sitting and waiting. Something dignified. Something that made clear she knew what they were doing and she knew they knew. Something they'd remember, even if only in the uncomfortable hours of 3 in the morning when the things you've done come back wearing the faces of the people you did them to. What came out instead was, "You're killing me. You know that." Nobody answered. "The passes are closed. It's 15 below up on that ridge. You're not evicting me. You're just making someone else pull the trigger." She looked at Greer specifically. "Or too cowardly to do it yourselves." Walt Pruitt said, "Nobody's stopping you from going south. The southern pass has been closed for a month. That's not our problem." "No," she said, "it's mine. That's the point, isn't it?" She started walking. What else was there to do? She walked west along the main street because that at least was the direction that would take her through town and out the other side. And she'd rather walk through them than around them. Let them look. Let them count what they'd done. She was halfway down the street when she heard the horse. She smelled him before she saw him, which was how most people encountered Cole Mercer for the first time. A complex and not entirely unpleasant mix of pine resin, wood smoke, animal fur, and something older underneath, like cold earth and weathered leather. People who'd only heard of him described him one way, and people who'd actually met him described him differently. And the difference between those two descriptions was wide enough to build a town in. He came down the main street from the north end on a big gray horse with a Roman nose, and the calm, disinterested expression of an animal that had seen things in the mountains that would rearrange a person's priorities. Cole himself was large enough that the horse didn't look large under him, which was saying something. He wore a coat made of something that had been alive not long ago, a hat pulled low against the wind, and the kind of face that had been rearranged a few times and settled into its final configuration, looking like it didn't owe anything an apology. He was maybe 35, maybe 40, hard to say with the beard and the weathering. His hands on the reins were enormous and scarred at the knuckles, and he carried a rifle across his saddle the way most people carry something they might need in a moment's notice. He pulled up the horse in the middle of the street, looked at Evelyn, looked at the crowd, looked back at Evelyn. "Where you headed?" he said. She blinked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "I said, where you headed? You're walking with a pack. In winter. Where are you going?" "That," she said carefully, "is not your concern." "Where's she going?" Cole said to the crowd. Not as a question, more as an indictment stated in the form of one. Harlan Greer stepped forward. "Town business, Mercer. Stay out of it." Cole looked at Greer the way you might look at something unpleasant you'd found in your boot. "You ran her out. Council order. In December. The law's the law." "The law." Cole let the word sit in the cold air for a moment. "That what you're calling it?" He looked back at Evelyn. "What's your name?" "Evelyn Harper?" Something shifted in his expression. Not recognition exactly, more like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "The widow." "Yes." You got somewhere to go? She thought about lying. She considered the various versions of a lie that would let her keep some dignity intact here. But lies cost energy, and she was short on that. No, she said. He reached back into his saddlebag and came out with a pair of gloves, heavy, lined with something she couldn't identify from where she stood. He held them out toward her. It's a 3-hour ride up to my place, he said. You can have the spare room. The crowd went very quiet. Evelyn stared at him. You don't know me. No. You don't know anything about me. I know what I see. He nodded toward the crowd. And I know what that looks like. Cole Mercer. That was Arthur Kane, the mayor, appearing from somewhere behind the crowd with the expression of a man who'd just found something in his house that he'd thought he'd gotten rid of. Kane was a tall man, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that came from never having been hungry. I'm going to ask you to step back from this. You're going to ask me, Cole said. This woman's been ordered to walk into a closed mountain pass in December. Cole's voice didn't rise. That was the particular thing about it. It stayed at the same level the whole time, which somehow made it worse. That what you told her to do, Arthur? Kane's jaw tightened. The council has jurisdiction. Over me? Cole tilted his head slightly. Do you, Arthur? You got jurisdiction over me? The question hung there. Kane didn't answer it, which was its own answer. Cole looked back at Evelyn. My offer stands, he said. You come with me. You have a roof and a fire and food. You work for it. I'm not running a charity operation. I want that clear. But you're not walking into that pass. Evelyn looked at him. Then she looked at the mountains behind him, their white peaks cutting hard lines against the sky. Then she looked at the crowd, at Harlan Greer's sour face, at Walt Pruitt's disappointed grin, because this wasn't going to end the way he'd hoped, at Arthur Kane and his silver hair and his jurisdiction, and something crystallized in her chest. All right, she said. Cole reached down a hand. She took it. He pulled her up behind him in one motion that suggested he was considerably stronger than he looked, which was already considerable, and the horse shifted under the new weight and then settled. Mercer. That was Kane again, one last attempt. This is not... Goodbye, Arthur, Cole said, and turned the horse north. They didn't talk for the first hour. She didn't know if that was his habit or if he was giving her time, and she decided it didn't matter either way because she needed the time regardless. She spent it cataloging what had happened, the notice under the door, the walk through town, the crowd, and then this large, strange man on a gray horse who'd come out of the mountains and offered her something nobody else had bothered to. The town dropped away behind them. The road, if you could call it that, more of a suggestion of repeated passage, climbed through a stand of snow-heavy pines, and then switch-backed up the first ridge, the horse picking its way with the patience of an animal that knew this ground cold. You're going to want to lean in when we go up the steep parts, Cole said, breaking the silence without ceremony. Balance. Nothing personal. Understood, she said. Another 20 minutes went by. You know what they said about me, she said. Not a question. I've heard. Do you believe it? He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't rush the answer. I've seen a few people in my time who were actually guilty of what they were accused of, he said finally. They carry it different, like they're waiting to be found out. He paused. You don't carry it like that. That's not exactly a declaration of innocence. No, he agreed. It's not, but it's what I've got. She considered that. And you're willing to act on it. I acted on what I saw, which is a crowd of people running a woman out of town in the worst month of the year. I didn't need to know your whole story for that. She sat with it. What do you want from me? She asked. In exchange for the room. Work, he said. I trap through the winter. I'm out on the line most days from before light until late afternoon. The cabin needs tending, fire, cooking, whatever repairs come up. I can't do all of it myself. That's it? That's it. Nothing else. He looked back at her over his shoulder, a brief glance. No, he said. Nothing else. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why, given that she had approximately no reliable track record of correctly assessing men's intentions, as Thomas Harper had demonstrated comprehensively. But something in the way he said it, matter of fact, almost bored by the question, made her believe him. All right, she said again. The cabin came into view as the light was going gray and long across the snow. It was not what she'd expected, which she realized she'd been constructing expectations without any real information to base them on. She'd imagined something small and rough, a trapper's box, something functional to the point of brutality. What she saw was substantial. 2 stories, or close enough, with a steep roof built for shedding snow. A covered porch running along the front, a solid stone chimney, outbuildings off to the right, a woodshed, what looked like a skinning shed, a small barn. The whole thing sat in a clearing backed up against a rock face, sheltered from the north wind by the cliff and from the east by a heavy stand of pines. "You built this," she said. "Mostly. Yourself." "Mostly," he said again. She climbed down from the horse and stood in the snow and looked at it. The clearing was quiet in the way that only remote places could be. Not the absence of sound exactly, but a different quality of it, as if the mountain was listening to itself instead of to people. Cole led the horse toward the barn, and she followed. "Spare rooms at the top of the stairs," he said, pulling the saddle. "Blankets in the chest. Fire in the main room should still be going. I banked it before I came down. You plan to bring someone back with you?" He shook his head. "I plan to spend the night in town and come back in the morning. Didn't work out that way." "Why did you come down in the first place?" He hung the saddle on its rack and started working on the horse's bridle, and she saw a kind of economy in his movements that spoke of years of doing the same things in the same order without wasted motion. "Supply run," he said. "Needed a few things." She waited. He glanced at her. "And I'd heard about the council meeting. Someone mentioned it at the feed store last time I was down. Figured I'd see how it played out." "You came specifically to see what they did with me." "I came to do my supply run. I happened to be there when the other thing happened." She wasn't sure she believed that, but she let it go. He finished with the horse and started toward the cabin, and she followed him across the snow toward the porch, and she thought, "This is either the wisest thing you've ever done or the most desperate." And then, maybe those are the same thing. The first week passed in the specific and merciless way of survival. No room for abstraction, no space for anything beyond the immediate physical demands of staying warm and fed at altitude in winter. She learned the cabin, learned its particular logic, where the wood was stacked and why, which boards in the floor had soft spots and would rot through if you got them wet, how the chimney needed to be adjusted in high wind to keep it from backdrafting smoke into the room, what the water situation was with the well and when it was likely to freeze, and what you did when it did. There was a system to everything, built by a man who'd lived alone long enough that the system was entirely his, and followed rules that made sense once you understood them, and looked arbitrary until you did. She worked. She'd told him she would, and she meant it, not as a performance of gratitude. She wasn't built for that, and she suspected he'd have found it irritating anyway. But because the work was there, and she was there, and it needed doing. She cooked what there was to cook, which turned out to be more varied than she'd expected. Cole's stores were well stocked, a sign of genuine preparation rather than improvisation. She kept the fire. She mended things that needed mending. She started taking inventory of the supplies, not because he'd asked, but because it made sense and she needed something to do with her mind. On the 4th day, she found a loose shutter on the east side of the cabin and fixed it with tools she found in the barn. Cole came back that evening and noticed and didn't say anything about it, which she'd already started to understand was its own kind of acknowledgement. "Wind's picking up," he said, dropping his pack by the door and moving to the fire. "Going to get bad by morning." "I made a stew," she said. "Used the salt pork and some of the dried beans." He looked at the pot and then at her. "You made cornbread." "There was cornmeal." "Yeah." Something in his face shifted, something small and difficult to name. "I know." They ate at the table across from each other, which was strange in its mundane ordinariness. 2 people eating dinner in a kitchen in a cabin like it was a thing people did. "You've been taking stock," he said. "The supplies. Yes, I hope that's—" "It's fine." He broke off a piece of cornbread. "What did you find?" "You're well stocked for most things. You're low on salt. You'll need more lamp oil by February. Your flour will last another month, maybe 5 weeks if we're careful." She paused. "I noticed you have 2 sets of everything, plates, cups. You didn't buy those for yourself." He ate without answering. "Were you married?" she asked. "No." She waited. "A friend," he said finally. "Someone I thought might end up here. Didn't work out." She nodded and didn't push, and they finished the meal in a silence that was, for the first time, not uncomfortable. The storm Cole had predicted came in 3 days rather than one, building slowly the way the worst ones did, starting with a change in the light, a particular flat quality to the sky, then the wind, then the snow arriving almost as an afterthought to everything that came before it. By the third day, it was genuinely vicious. She spent those days learning the internal rhythms of the cabin, how Cole moved through a space, where he put things, when he slept and when he didn't, what he read. The Bible, which surprised her, worn down to its spine, along with 2 almanacs and a legal text that she couldn't imagine the context of. He was quieter than anyone she'd ever been around, not hostile, not cold, just still. Like the mountain had gotten into him somehow, all that patience and endurance. She was not by nature still. Her mind ran fast and her hands needed something to do, and silence, for her, had always been a space that needed filling. Back in the life she'd had before Thomas and his disasters, she'd taught school. She liked the noise of it, the questions, the constant motion of 20 minds at once. Sitting quiet had always felt like a waste of capacity, but she was learning. On the second night of the storm, she was sitting near the fire with needle and thread, working on a shirt of his that had torn at the seam when she heard it. She stopped, listened. It was probably the storm. The wind did things to sound up here, found gaps in the logs and made voices out of nothing, turned the howl of air into something almost human. She went back to the shirt, and then she heard it again. Not the wind. Below her feet, a low sound, rhythmic, like something moving in a space that wasn't large enough for moving in. She looked down at the floor. The boards were thick and old, darkened with years of fire smoke and boot oil. In the corner behind the stove, there was a seam. She'd noticed it before, but assumed it was a repair, a patch of different-aged wood. Now, looking at it properly, she saw the shape of a door, a trap door, set into the floor, nearly invisible in the low light, the kind of thing you wouldn't see if you weren't looking. She set the shirt aside, stood up, took one step toward it. "Don't." She spun. Cole was standing at the bottom of the stairs. She hadn't heard him come down. He had a way of moving, she'd noticed, that was very quiet for a large man. He wasn't angry. His face was hard to read in the firelight, but it wasn't anger. "Don't go near that door," he said. "I heard something," she said. "From below." "I know." "What's down there?" His jaw worked. "That's not something you need to know right now." "Colt, I'm asking you," he said, and there was something in his voice that she recognized. Not a threat, nothing like that, but a weight. Something that had gravity to it. "Stay away from that door. I'll explain what I can, when I can." She stood there looking at him in the trapdoor and back at him. She could push it. She could demand an explanation. She was sharing this man's house, and she'd heard something under the floorboards, and she had every right to know what it was. She could stand here and make it a thing, or she could look at his face, at the lines of it, at the way he was carrying whatever this was. "All right," she said, for the third time in a week. She sat back down by the fire and picked up the shirt. Cole stood at the bottom of the stairs a little longer, watching her. Then he went back up. The sound from below didn't come again that night, but she'd heard it, and she didn't forget. The weeks that followed were hard in the way that February at elevation is always hard. Not dramatic, not acute, just relentless. The cold had a weight to it. The work had a weight to it. Some days the snow came down so thick that visibility dropped to the length of your arm, and the cabin became the whole world. She found herself adjusting. Not to comfort. Comfort wasn't available in any significant quantity, but to something underneath comfort, a kind of bedrock functionality. Her body got stronger. The first week her hands had bled from the firewood, the cold opening cracks in skin that wasn't used to it. By the third week the cracks had healed and the calluses had come, and she could split a reasonable log without stopping to think about it. She stopped waking up in the night expecting to be in the cabin behind the livery stable. Started waking up and knowing where she was. Cole came and went on his trapline. Some days he'd say maybe a dozen words to her. Some days he'd come back and they'd eat and she'd ask him something and he'd actually answer, really answer, in more than monosyllables. And those evenings felt like something had cracked open slightly. He told her about how he'd come to the mountain, an abbreviated version she suspected, heavily edited, but real enough. He'd come from Kentucky, originally, had worked his way west doing various things, some of which he was vague about and some of which he wasn't. He'd found this ridge 9 years ago and stayed. "Why?" she asked. "What made you stop here?" He was working on a snare by the fire, his large hands moving through the process with that same economy of motion she'd come to recognize. "I stopped fighting the place," he said. "Most places, you fight them. You try to make them into something they're not. This mountain," he paused, "it's exactly what it is, every day, no pretending." "People aren't like that," she said. "No," he agreed, "they're not." She thought of Black Ridge, of Arthur Kane's silver hair and his pretend jurisdiction, of Harlan Greer's righteous face selling her starvation as moral principle. Thomas wasn't like that, she said, and then was surprised she'd said it because she generally didn't bring Thomas up. Cole didn't push, just kept working on the snare. "He was exactly the kind of person you're describing," she said, "the kind who makes themselves into something. Showed me a version of himself that—" She stopped. "I wasn't stupid. I want to say that. I'm not trying to excuse my own judgment, but he was very good at it. He'd had years of practice at it." "Did you love him?" She thought about it honestly. "I loved who I thought he was," she said, which I know sounds like a deflection, but I mean it as a real distinction. The man I thought I married was worth loving. The man he turned out to be wasn't the same person. Cole tied off the snare and set it down. "You're still angry," he said. "Yes." "At him." "Yes, and at myself." She looked at the fire. "At Black Ridge, too. But that's simpler. That's just people being what they are when it's safe to be that way. Thomas," she shook her head, "that's more complicated." "Anger at someone you loved always is," he said. Something in the way he said it made her look at him. He was looking at the fire, too. "The friend," she said, careful. "The one you bought the second plate for." He didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he said eventually. "They hurt you." "They made choices," he said. "I made some too, that's all." She nodded. They sat with the fire between them and the storm doing whatever it was doing outside, which tonight was a low, sustained moan around the eaves. And the silence was a different thing than it had been at the start. Not empty, not uncomfortable. Something that had been worked into a different shape by weeks of sharing space and words and the specific honesty that comes when there's no audience and nowhere to go, Sad. She was almost asleep when she heard it again, the sound from below. Clearer this time. The storm had died down and the cabin was quiet, and there was no ambiguity. It was a voice, muffled by the floor and whatever space lay beneath it, but a voice, saying something she couldn't make out. She lay still in her bed upstairs and listened. The voice stopped, started again. Then she heard Cole's footsteps on the stairs, going down. Heard the creak of the main room floor, a sound she'd learned to identify as the trapdoor. That particular groan of wood. A brief exchange she couldn't hear, then the trapdoor again. Then silence. She stared at the ceiling. There is a person in that cellar. She was not imagining it. She had not imagined it. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up and thought about Cole Mercer. His face in the firelight when he'd said, "Don't go near that door." The weight in his voice that she'd read as burden rather than threat. She thought about the legal text in his small library. She thought about the way he moved, the way he carried himself. The 1,000 small competencies of a man who'd learned to operate in spaces where one mistake could mean you didn't come back. She didn't know what was in that cellar. There were several possibilities, and some of them were terrifying. But she thought about what he'd given her, a roof, a fire, food, space. She thought about the way he'd ridden into Black Ridge and looked at the crowd and looked at her and made a decision based not on what he knew, but on what he saw. She thought about the plate he'd bought for someone who never came. She thought, "You've been wrong before." She thought, "But you've been right before too." And she fell asleep with the sound of the mountain outside and whatever was beneath the floor below her, and she did not have an answer yet, but she thought she understood, for the first time in a long time, what it meant to make a choice on incomplete information. Not blindly, not carelessly, but with the full knowledge that certainty was not available and you acted anyway. That was the first night she slept all the way through until morning. Outside, the wind had gone completely still. The kind of quiet that, up on a mountain in the deep of winter, could mean many things. Not all of them good. 3 weeks into her time on the mountain, Evelyn stopped counting days. It wasn't that the days stopped mattering. It was that they'd taken on a different texture, no longer marked by what she'd failed to accomplish or what new indignity Black Ridge had found to offer, but by smaller, more physical things. Whether the morning was still or windy, whether Cole came back early from the line or late, whether the water in the bucket by the door had frozen over by midnight or held out until 3. She was changing. She could feel it in practical ways. Her hands, the way she moved through the cabin now without bumping into things, the fact that she could bank a fire properly and keep it through the night without waking twice to feed it. But there were other changes underneath those, harder to name. She was quieter in her own head. The noise that had been constant since Thomas died, that running loop of what should I have known and where did I go wrong and what happens to me now, had gotten lower. Not gone, just lower. She still heard the sounds from the cellar, not every night, but regularly enough that she'd stopped startling at them, which was its own strange kind of adjustment, the way you can learn to sleep through a sound if you hear it enough, and nothing terrible happens as a result. She'd hear it, the movement, occasionally the voice, low and indistinct, and she'd lie in her bed and she'd think about what she'd decided, that she was going to trust Cole until she had real cause not to. She'd hold that decision in her head like a lamp, something to see by in the dark. Cole knew she'd heard it. He hadn't said so directly, but she'd caught him watching her across the dinner table with an expression that was partly calculation and partly something else, something that might have been the beginning of guilt. She didn't push. She waited. That was something the mountain had been teaching her, whether she'd asked to learn it or not. It was a Thursday. She was fairly certain it was Thursday. She'd been marking notches on a piece of wood she kept under her mattress, an old habit from a childhood with a difficult father who kept his promises by the calendar and punished her if she forgot which day it was. When Cole came back from the trapline 2 hours earlier than usual, she heard the horse before she heard him, which was normal. Then the barn door, then his boots on the porch, then the particular sound of him knocking snow off his coat before he came inside. She was at the table sorting dried beans, picking out the ones that had gone bad over storage. He came in and stopped and looked at her and said, "I need to tell you something." She set down the beans. He took off his hat and held it and didn't sit down. He had a way of standing in the room that filled it, not aggressively, just physically. The cabin was not a small space, but Cole in it made it feel more contained. He was wet from the knees down from a creek crossing, and he'd taken a knock on his cheekbone from somewhere, a red mark that would color up into a bruise by evening. "There's a man in the cellar," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. He'd been braced for more reaction than that. "How long have you known?" "I heard a voice the second week. I wasn't sure at first. I was sure by the end of that week." He sat down then, across from her, and put his hat on the table between them. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked out the window, which showed nothing but the wall of pines and the white light of an overcast afternoon. "His name is Del Rourke," he said. Evelyn went very still. Rourke. That name. That was the name in Thomas's papers, the ones she'd found in the false bottom of his travel case after he died, the ones she'd read 3 times trying to understand what she was looking at. Rourke arrangement, 20%, delivery by November. "Del Rourke," she said. "Is he related to a man named Rourke who my husband—" "His brother," Cole said. "Younger brother. Goes by Del to keep some distance from the family name." He looked at her. "You've heard the name." "Thomas had correspondence with someone called Rourke. I didn't know what it meant. I still don't entirely." Cole was quiet for a moment, working out something in his head. She'd seen him do this before. He didn't speak until he'd gotten his thoughts in order, which she'd initially read as evasiveness and had come to understand as care. He didn't want to say the wrong thing, and when someone's silence came from that rather than from indifference, you learned to wait. "The payroll robbery," he said, "the one your husband was involved in. That wasn't Thomas's plan." She looked at him. "Thomas was recruited," Cole said, "by Daniel Rourke, Del's older brother, the one that ran the operation. Thomas knew the route, knew the timing, because he'd done legitimate transport work for some of the same mining operations. He was a weak point, and someone found him and used him. He paused. I don't say that to excuse him. He made choices, but he wasn't the architect. Who was? Cole's jaw tightened. That's the part that gets complicated. Tell me the complicated part. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze, and she thought, this is it. This is the thing that's been sitting underneath everything since I got here, and I would rather know it than not. The robbery was planned by Daniel Rourke, Cole said slowly, who was taking orders from someone else. Someone with money and standing and a great deal to gain from those 6 men not receiving their wages when they were supposed to. He looked at his hat on the table. Someone in Black Ridge. The cabin was very quiet. The council, she said. One member of it, specifically. He looked up at her. Arthur Kane. She heard the name, and something happened in her chest that wasn't quite surprise. It was the feeling of a thing you'd half known taking its final shape, like watching fog burn off a mountain in the morning and seeing what was underneath. Arthur Kane, the mayor. The silver-haired man with his jurisdiction and his deliberate steps back in the town square, watching her walk away with the patience of a man who'd already won. The stolen payroll, she said. What happened to it? Most of it was moved once. Daniel Rourke had it somewhere in the valley. He died before he could deliver it to Kane. Something unrelated. A fight over a card game, 3 months before Thomas died. The money's been in a kind of limbo since then. Kane can't claim it without drawing attention to why he wants it. The Rourke operation fell apart without Daniel running it. Cole looked at her steadily. Del Rourke knows where it is. He's the only one left who does. That's why he came to me. Why did he come to you specifically? Cole was quiet for a moment. Because I'm not connected to Kane or to Black Ridge. Because Del trusted that I'd at least hear him out before doing anything he wouldn't like. He shifted in his chair. And because he knew I had some reason of my own to want Kane held accountable. What reason? He didn't answer right away. His eyes went to the window again, and she watched his profile. The straight line of his nose, broken once and reset imperfectly, the set of his jaw. A man named Garrett worked for me, he said, 2 winters ago. Good man, good trapper. He found out something about the Kane operation. Overhead something he shouldn't have down in town. Came back up here and told me about it. He stopped. A week later, he went back down for supplies. He didn't come back. The weight of that settled over the room. They killed him, Evelyn said. I can't prove it. I've never been able to prove it. He could have just... There are ways to die up here that don't require anyone's help. But... He looked at his hands. But I know what I think happened. She sat with that for a while. The beans were still in front of her on the table, the bad ones separated into a small pile to the left. The fire was doing its work behind her. Del Rourke is hiding from Kane's people, she said. Yes. Kane knows Del is the last link to the money and the last person who can implicate him. He's had people looking for Del since Daniel died. Cole looked at her directly. Del came to me because he needed somewhere safe while we figured out how to get the information to the federal marshal in Halford without Kane intercepting it. And you said yes. I said yes. And you didn't tell me. He held her gaze. No, he said. I didn't, and I should have. I was trying to... I thought it was safer for you to not know. If Kane's people came asking questions, you couldn't say anything you didn't know. That's a reasonable argument, she said. It's also convenient. Yes, he said. It is. She appreciated that he didn't try to dress it up as purely altruistic. She'd gotten good, over the past months, at detecting when a man was explaining himself versus justifying himself, and Cole was doing the former, laying it out flat, not trying to make it look better than it was. Thomas's involvement, she said, his name being on the robbery. Can Del clear that? Cole's expression shifted. Something careful and precise moved through his face. Del can testify that Thomas was recruited rather than the origin of the plan. That won't undo what Thomas did, but it would change how it's understood. He paused. And it would change how you're understood, because if Kane is exposed as the architect, if the whole thing unravels from the top down, then the story of the widow of the outlaw looks a lot different. She sat with that too. She thought about Harlan Greer's face, about the notice under her door, about walking through Black Ridge with her bundle while people watched from a safe distance, wrapped in the comfort of their certainty that she deserved it. She thought about what it would mean to walk back into Black Ridge with the truth preceding her. "I want to meet him," she said. Cole blinked. "Dell." "Yes." "Evelyn, I'm involved in this whether I knew it or not," she said. "My husband was recruited by his brother. My name has been attached to this theft for months. Whatever happens next, it affects me directly." She kept her voice level. "I want to meet the man living under my feet." Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He got up and went to the corner behind the stove, and she watched him find the edge of the trap door with 2 fingers and lift it. A section of floor rising smooth on hinges that had been well oiled, kept silent deliberately. Steep wooden steps dropped into darkness. "Dell," Cole said, his voice going down into the space below. "Come up." A pause, then footsteps on the wooden stairs. Del Rourke was not what she'd expected, but she'd learned by now that people rarely were. He was small, smaller than his brother's name had made her imagine. A lean man of maybe 30, with a sharp face and watchful eyes the color of creek water. He had a beard that had gone past deliberate into just neglected, and his clothes were worn but not ragged. He moved with a wariness that wasn't exactly fear, more like a man who'd been in bad situations long enough that his body had permanently recalibrated its baseline level of alertness. He came up the stairs and stopped when he saw her and looked at Cole. "This is Evelyn Harper," Cole said. "Thomas Harper's widow." Del Rourke's face did something complicated. He looked at her like a man who owes a debt and has just been presented with the person he owes it to. "Mrs. Harper," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, with a Kentucky accent not unlike Cole's. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "your brother recruited my husband." "Yes, ma'am, he did." "He's dead. My husband." "You know that." "I know. I'm sorry for it." She studied his face. "Are you sorry for what it did to him, or what it did to me?" Del blinked. It wasn't the question he'd expected. "Both," he said after a moment. "If I'm being straight with you." "Be straight with me," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He sat down, slowly, like a man whose joints had been unhappy in the cold cellar, and put his hands on the table and looked at them. "Daniel didn't tell me everything he was running," he said. "I knew there was a job. I knew it involved the mining payroll. I didn't know who was behind it on the money side until after Daniel was dead and I got into his papers." He looked up at her. "When I found Kane's name, when I understood what I was looking at, I knew I had 2 choices. Bring it to someone who could do something with it, or run and keep running until one of Kane's people found me. You chose a 3rd option," Evelyn said. "I came to Cole." Del glanced at Cole across the table. "Which is maybe the same as the first choice, just slower." "The money," she said. "Where is it?" Del's eyes went to Cole. "She's in this," Cole said simply. "Tell her." Del looked back at her. "There's a claim about 6 miles east of here. Old silver operation, played out 3 years back. Abandoned. Daniel used one of the shafts to store it." He paused. "There's enough there to account for the original theft, plus what Kane had siphoned from other sources over the years. It's a lot of money, Mrs. Harper. Enough that Kane isn't going to just let this go when it starts to unravel." "It hasn't started to unravel yet," she said. "No," Del said. "But once we get word to the federal marshal, how are you planning to do that?" Del and Cole exchanged a look. "That," Cole said carefully, "is what we've been trying to work out." She leaned back in her chair and looked at both of them. This strange pair, the large, careful mountain man and the small, watchful fugitive. And she understood that they'd been circling this problem in the cellar and around the edges of dinners and in whatever conversation she hadn't been present for, and they hadn't solved it. "The passes," she said. "Yes," Cole said. "The southern pass is still closed. The eastern one—" He hesitated. "A man could make it through the eastern pass. It's hard and it's dangerous, but it's possible. And if you go, you leave Del here. And if Kane's people come while I'm gone—" "I know how to use a rifle," she said. Both men looked at her. "Thomas wasn't good for much," she said, "but he taught me to shoot. He said a woman alone needed to know. She held Cole's gaze. He wasn't wrong about everything. Cole was quiet. "How long to the marshal's office in Halford?" she asked. 3 days there and back in good conditions, Cole said. "In these conditions? 4, maybe 5. She looked at the trap door still open in the floor. "Then we need to talk about what happens if someone comes before you get back." Del Rourke looked at her with those creekwater eyes, and something moved through his expression. A shift from wariness to something more complicated, something that might have been the beginning of relief or the beginning of respect, or possibly both. Cole got up from the table without a word and went to the cabinet by the door. He opened it and came back with a rifle. Not the one he carried on the line, a different one, older but well-maintained, and he set it on the table in front of her. She looked at it, looked at him. 2 days, he said. "I want to wait 2 days. The weather needs to break on the eastern slope, or I won't make it through. 2 days, we go over everything. What you do if someone comes, where Del can go if the cabin is compromised, where the supplies are, how to signal if there's trouble." He put his hand on the table, not touching the rifle, not touching her, just there. 2 days and then I go. She put her hand on the rifle. 2 days, she agreed. Outside, the wind had come up while they sat inside talking, and it pressed against the north wall of the cabin with a low, sustained sound, and the fire in the grate responded by pulling harder, drawing in air, burning hotter, the way fire does when it senses competition from the cold. Del Rourke looked from Cole to Evelyn and back to Cole with an expression that said, plainly, that he'd expected many things when he'd climbed those stairs, but not this. The night came down fast the way it did at elevation in winter, the light going from gray to blue to black in what felt like no time at all, and the three of them sat around the table with the fire going and the storm building outside. And for the first time in a long time, something that had been broken into pieces started very tentatively to look like a plan. It was not a good plan. Evelyn knew that, and she suspected Cole knew it too. And Del Rourke had the face of a man who'd been living inside bad plans long enough to recognize one. But it was the plan they had, and the alternative was waiting in the dark until Kane's people found them. She'd been waiting in the dark since December. She thought she was done with that. The 2 days Cole had asked for passed in a specific kind of tension that Evelyn had no previous word for. Not dread exactly, not anticipation, something between them that had its own weight and texture, like the air before a storm when you can feel the electricity before you can see the sky change. They used the time well. That was the one thing she could say about those 48 hours. They were not wasted. Cole went over everything with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the difference between a plan and a wish was the quality of the preparation underneath it. He showed her the rifle properly, not in the way Thomas had taught her, quick, impatient, assuming she'd figure out what he skipped, but methodically, taking it apart and putting it back together twice until she could do it herself without looking. He showed her where the ammunition was stored. He showed her the back of the cabin where a narrow gap in the rock face led to a shallow cave he'd used in bad weather, big enough for 2 people if they didn't mind being uncomfortable, invisible from the clearing unless you already knew it was there. "If more than 4 men come and you can't hold the cabin," he said, "you take Del and you go to the cave. You take the rifle, the ammunition, food for 2 days. You don't try to be heroic. You survive until I get back. And if you don't get back," he looked at her, "then you wait until spring and you go south." She didn't argue with the logic of it. Del came up from the cellar during the days now, which changed the dynamic of the cabin in ways that were strange and not entirely comfortable. He was a quiet man, Del, but his quiet was different from Cole's. Where Cole's silence had a settled quality to it, something rooted, Del's had the feel of a man who was always half listening for something he didn't want to hear. He flinched at sounds. He sat with his back to the wall. His eyes went to the windows too often. But he was not a bad man. Evelyn had made her judgments about that carefully, watching him over those 2 days, the way he spoke about his brother with a grief that was real and complicated, a man mourning someone he'd loved and couldn't respect. The way he talked about the men who'd lost their wages in the robbery, naming them, knowing their names, carrying that in a way that said it wasn't abstract to him. "You could have run," she told him on the second evening. Cole was outside doing a final check on the horse and his gear, and she and Del were at the table with the fire going. "When Daniel died and you found out what Kane was, you could have just disappeared. Dell looked at his hands. I thought about it. But you didn't. I got a sister in Missouri, he said. 2 nephews. If I run and Kane's people track me, they'd find her eventually. That's how men like Kane work. You run, and they follow, and they're not particular about who they hurt along the way. He looked up. Only way to stop that is to stop Kane. She nodded. Besides, Dell said, and something shifted in his expression, a kind of rueful self-awareness. Daniel made a mess. Rourke family made a mess. Felt like a Rourke ought to have some part in cleaning it up. Cole came back in then, stamping snow from his boots, and he looked at both of them at the table, and something in his face said he was glad to see it, the two of them talking without the air going sharp between them. He left before first light the next morning. Evelyn was awake when he came downstairs, though she'd been lying in the dark for an hour before that, listening to the sounds of the cabin and the mountain around it, trying to decide if she was scared. She was. She knew that clearly enough, but fear had a particular quality to it that she'd been learning to work with rather than against. It sharpened things when you let it, made the edges of the world more distinct. She got up and went downstairs. Cole was at the table with a cup of coffee he must have made quietly, his pack by the door, his coat already on. He looked up when she came down and didn't look surprised to see her. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. They didn't say much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said. The plan was what it was. The risks were what they were. Language at that point would have been filling silence for its own sake, which neither of them had ever been inclined toward. After a while, Cole said, "I'll be back in 4 days, 5 at the outside." "I know. Dell's more capable than he looks. If something happens, Cole." She met his eyes. "Go." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his pack and his rifle and he went out into the dark, and she heard the horse moving in the barn and then the sound of hoofbeats going away up the trail toward the eastern pass, getting quieter until the mountain swallowed them. She sat at the table until it was fully light. Then she went to the trap door and knocked twice on the floor beside it, the signal they'd worked out. "Dell," she said, "come up. We've got work to do." The first day was quiet. Too quiet, probably, but she didn't say that to Dell. He knew it as well as she did. They were both people who'd been in enough uncertain situations to read the quality of quiet correctly, and this one had a held breath feeling that set the hairs on her arms up. She kept the fire low enough to reduce the smoke visible from below. She kept the front shutters angled so that the lamplight didn't show clearly from the trail. These were things Cole had told her to do, and she did them without resentment, because they made sense, and because she'd come far enough from Black Ridge in her own head to understand that pride about following reasonable instructions was a luxury she couldn't afford. Dell helped. He was, it turned out, a competent man in practical ways. He fixed the loose hinge on the cellar door that had been making a sound she'd been meaning to deal with. He identified a gap in the cabin's north wall that was letting in cold and plugged it with the same mix of clay and dry grass Cole used for the purpose. He knew his way around a kitchen well enough, which surprised her. "Daniel and I grew up fending for ourselves," he said, by way of explanation, when she raised an eyebrow at how efficiently he'd put together a meal from what was in the stores. "Our mother died when I was 8. You learn or you don't eat." "How old was Daniel?" 12. She thought about that. A 12-year-old and an 8-year-old left to manage themselves. The shape that made a person. The shortcuts it taught you. "He wasn't all bad," she said. "Not a defense, just a statement." "No," Dell said. "He wasn't. He was the best person I knew for a long time." He plated the food and set it on the table and sat down. "That makes it harder, not easier. If he'd been bad all the way through, I could have walked away from him years ago." They ate. On the second day, the weather shifted. It came in from the northwest, which Cole had told her was the direction to watch. The storms that built over the high peaks to the northwest could descend fast, and they came with wind that made everything harder: visibility, movement, sound. By mid-morning, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and the pines at the clearing's edge were moving in ways that made her think of agitation, of something trying to get loose. She was carrying wood from the shed to the porch when she saw the tracks. She stopped, set down the wood carefully without dropping it, because dropping it would make noise. The tracks came in from the west, not from the trail Cole used, which came from the north, but from a different angle, cutting across the lower edge of the clearing at a point where the tree line was thickest. Boot prints. 2 sets, maybe 3. Hard to be certain because the wind had already started working at the edges, softening them. Recent. Within the last hour, she estimated. Maybe less. She picked up the wood and carried it to the porch with the same pace she'd been using, as if she hadn't seen anything, as if she were just a woman doing a morning chore in the cold. She went inside. She set the wood down by the stove. "Dell," she said, keeping her voice low and flat. "We have company." He was across the room and had looked out the side window before she finished the sentence. "How many?" he said. 2 or 3 sets of tracks, coming from the west." He looked at her. "They came around the trail. They're trying to approach from a direction Cole wouldn't have covered." "Yes." She was already at the cabinet, pulling out the rifle. "Get in the cellar." "I'm not—" "Dell." She looked at him. "You're the only person who can place Kane at the robbery. You're the only person who knows where the money is. You're the only thing that makes any of this worth anything." She held his gaze. "Get in the cellar and don't come out unless I tell you to." He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he went. She shut the trapdoor over him and pulled the corner of the rug back into place the way Cole had shown her, obscuring the seam. Then she went to the window, the east-facing one, angled so she could see the clearing without being directly visible from it, and she waited. They came out of the tree line 10 minutes later. 3 men. She'd been right about the number. They moved with the careful spacing of men who knew what they were doing, not bunched together, enough distance between them that you couldn't take more than one with a single shot. 2 of them she didn't recognize, hard-faced men in heavy coats with rifles carried at a working angle, the barrel-down posture of men who expected to use them. The third was Walt Pruitt. Of course it was Walt Pruitt. She thought of him grinning in the dry goods store, grinning on the street the day she left. He wasn't grinning now. His face was set in an expression of concentrated purpose, and she realized, watching him cross the clearing toward the cabin, that this was what Walt Pruitt looked like when he was being used for something. He'd found his function. It wasn't a pleasant thing to understand about a person. She thought about her options. If she did nothing, they'd come to the door. She could try to pretend she was alone, just a woman sheltering in a trapper's cabin, nothing to see. But they'd search the place. Men sent by Arthur Kane with rifles and no innocents didn't stop at the door. She could fire through the window, warning shot or otherwise. That committed her to a fight with 3 armed men. Cole's training was good, her eye was steady, but 3-1 in the open was not odds she'd have chosen. Or, she thought of what Cole had said about the cabin's positioning, backed against the rock face to the north, sheltered, which also meant the north wall of the cabin was essentially part of the cliff. There was a notch in the rock, maybe 20 feet up, directly above the cabin's north corner. Cole used it sometimes to watch the lower trail. She'd never been up there. The climbing was a series of cut holds in the rock that Cole managed with long legs and reach she didn't have. But she was lighter than Cole. She made the decision before she finished thinking it through, which was probably the only way you could make a decision like that. She went out the back of the cabin, the small door in the rear wall, low and narrow, designed to be invisible from the front clearing, and she moved around the base of the rock face. The cold hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't taken her coat, no time, and the wind was working against everything, hands, fingers, the concentration she needed to find the first hold in the rock. She climbed. It was not elegant. She cut her right hand on a sharp edge of stone 3 holds up, and felt the blood before she felt the pain. Warm, and then cold almost immediately. She slipped twice, caught herself, jammed her foot into a crack that wasn't quite big enough and used it anyway. Her arms burned. She was higher than she'd planned to be before she found the notch, and for a bad moment she wasn't sure she'd found the right one. But then she leveled out onto a narrow shelf of rock and looked down, and she could see the entire clearing laid out below her. The 3 men were at the cabin door. Walt Pruitt knocked. Or rather, he hit the door with the flat of his palm in the way people do when they're not really asking. She settled the rifle. Her hand was bleeding onto the stock, and she had to reseat her grip twice to find something that held without slipping. The wind was a problem. Gusting, irregular, the kind that made distance shooting unreliable at the best of times. She was maybe 40 feet above and 40 feet back from where the men stood. Walt hit the door again. She heard it open. Dell. Dell had come up. She felt a spike of pure fear, fast and cold. and then she realized Dell hadn't come up. The door had swung open from the impact. The latch had been loose for days. She'd known about it and hadn't fixed it. It had chosen this moment to give. The two men with rifles went through the door. Walt stayed on the porch. She heard them moving inside, heard something fall, heard a voice, not Dell's, one of the men calling something to the other. She held on Walt Pruitt. He was standing on the porch with his rifle in his hands and his back partially to her, looking at the tree line on the west side of the clearing. Looking for Cole, probably. Looking for something coming at them from the direction they expected, not from above. She heard the sound from inside go sharp, a crash, then voices raised, and she knew they'd found something. The cellar door, maybe, the rug disturbed, something. She didn't wait. She shifted her aim from Walt to the rifle he was carrying, specifically the stock, and she fired. The shot in that altitude, in that cold, was immensely loud. It rolled off the rock face and came back doubled, and Walt Pruitt went off the porch in the same instant, not hit, but reacting to a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. His rifle hit the porch rail and clattered down into the snow. The two men came back out of the cabin fast. She was already moving the rifle. She fired again. Into the snow 2 feet in front of the nearest man, a deliberate miss. And the message was clear enough. I can hit what I'm aiming at, and right now I'm choosing not to. All three of them scattered. They moved for the tree line. Fast, low, covering each other the way they'd been trained to. One of them fired back, twice, both shots going wide and high because they couldn't locate her position. She pressed herself flat against the rock and felt the cold through the front of her shirt, and breathed. She counted to 30, looked over the edge. The clearing was empty. She stayed on the shelf for 20 minutes, watching the tree line, rifle ready, not moving. The cold was serious now, working into her without a coat to stop it, and she could feel her hands going from uncomfortable to dangerous. But she waited. No movement from the trees. She climbed back down, which was harder than going up had been, her hands stiff, the cut one reopening on the descent. She got back through the rear door and into the cabin and went directly to the stove without taking time to check on anything else, and held both hands near the heat until she could feel them again. Then she went to the trap door and knocked. "Dell, it's clear. Come up." Silence for a moment. Then the door lifted from below. Dell came up the stairs and looked at her. At the blood on her hand, at the rifle, at whatever was on her face. "You were on the rock," he said. "Yes." "I heard the shots from down there. 2 of them." "Yes." He stood there. "They're gone?" "For now." She sat down at the table, the rifle across her knees. "They'll go back to Kane. He'll send more." She looked at Dell directly. "How long until Cole gets back?" "He left this morning, 3 days minimum." "Then we have 3 days." Dell sat down across from her slowly. His face was doing the thing she'd seen before, the calculation, the assessment of available options. She recognized it because she was doing the same thing. "They know someone's here, he said. "They know you didn't run." "Good," she said. He looked at her. "If they know someone's here and holding the cabin, they have to come back with more men," she said, "which takes time, which is time Cole has to get to Halford and back." She set the rifle on the table. "They can't let this go. Not with what you know, not with the money sitting in that shaft. Kane will come himself eventually." Dell was quiet for a moment. "You want Kane to come here." "I want this to end," she said. "Not run. End. If Kane comes here and Cole comes back with the marshal." "That's a lot of things going right in the right order." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at her cut hand. The bleeding had slowed. She'd need to wrap it, clean it, do it properly before it got cold and stiff and useless. "Dell," she said, not looking up, "before your brother got into this business, when you were young, your mother died when you were 8. Yeah. How did you get through it, the 2 of you?" He thought about it. "One day at a time, mostly. We didn't have a plan, we just got through the next thing, and then the next one." She nodded, went to get the cloth she'd used to wrap her hand. "Mrs. Harper," Dell said behind her. She turned. His expression was difficult to name, something that had started as guilt and traveled through a considerable amount of territory to get where it was now. "I know you didn't ask for any of this," he said. I know what it cost you. Your husband, your name, the town. He stopped. I can't give most of that back. But if Cole gets to the marshal, if this works, I'll testify to everything, every name, every date, every arrangement Daniel ever told me about. He held her gaze. I'll make sure they know Thomas was used. I'll make sure they know what Kane did to you specifically. It's not enough, but it's what I've got. She looked at him for a long moment. It's something, she said. She wrapped her hand and went back to the east window and watched the tree line, and the afternoon light changed over the clearing, going long and golden, and then fading toward gray, and the pines stood dark against the sky, and somewhere in them 3 men were deciding what to do next. She knew what she was doing next. She was staying exactly where she was. They came back on the 3rd night. She'd known they would. Not hoped, not feared, known, with the flat certainty of someone who'd stopped bargaining with probability and started simply accounting for it. She and Dell had spent the intervening days preparing in the specific way of people who understand they're outnumbered and are trying to make that matter less. Dell had turned out to have a practical mind for defensive problems, which she supposed made sense. A man who'd spent years adjacent to his brother's criminal operation had probably absorbed more tactical thinking than he'd ever wanted to. He showed her the angles from each window, which ones gave coverage of the clearing and which ones were blind spots. They moved the heavy table against the front wall below the main window. Not a barricade exactly, more a firing platform, something to brace against. They brought in all the wood from the porch so neither of them would need to open the door. They ate well, because Dell said you didn't know when the next chance would come, and he was right. At night she slept in 2-hour stretches, taking turns with Dell watching the east window. The second night she woke from one of those short sleeps with her heart already running fast, a sound in her ears that might have been a dream and might not, and she lay still in the dark of the cabin listening until she was sure the clearing was quiet. Then she got up and took the watch from Dell, who'd been awake since midnight and was developing the gray, hollowed look of a man fighting his own body's desire to quit. Sleep, she told him. You sure? Dell, sleep. He slept on the floor by the stove, wrapped in Cole's spare blanket, and she sat by the east window with the rifle across her knees and watched the darkness between the pines. Cole should have reached Halford by now. That thought she let herself have, not dwelling in it, not building anything fragile on top of it, but holding it as a simple fact. He'd been gone 2.5 days. The eastern pass was hard but passable. He knew the terrain like his own hands. He would have reached Halford. He would have found the marshal. She made herself stop there and not calculate what came next. The attack, when it came, started with the horse. It was clever. She had to acknowledge that later. They'd sent someone to the barn first, quiet, patient, working at the latch for what must have been a long time given how cold stiffened it was. She heard the horse react before she heard anything else, that particular sharp sound of an animal alarmed, and she was on her feet before it resolved into anything she could identify. She woke Dell with one hand on his shoulder, and when he came up from sleep she held a finger to her lips and pointed toward the barn. His eyes sharpened immediately. He reached for the pistol Cole had left with them and checked the load without making a sound, which she appreciated. She went to the west-facing window, the one that gave a partial view of the outbuildings, and in the pale snowlight she saw movement at the barn door. 1 man, maybe 2. Not Walt Pruitt this time, someone shorter. They were leading the horse out. They're taking the horse, Dell said quietly beside her. To make sure we can't run, she said, or to draw us out. She looked at the horse, Cole's gray, the one with the Roman nose and the disinterested expression, being led across the clearing toward the trees. Something moved in her chest, something that was partly anger and partly the recognition that they were better organized than she'd hoped. She didn't go out after the horse. Dell glanced at her. I know, she said, answering the question he hadn't asked. But if I go out there, they take me. The horse can be gotten back. I can't. He nodded. 3 minutes later, something hit the roof, a sound like a stone, except stones didn't roll the way this did. It traveled across the pitched surface, and then she smelled it, a thin, sharp thread of smoke that wasn't from the fireplace. She looked up at the ceiling and saw nothing yet, but she knew what was happening. They've got fire on the roof, she said. The snow. It's been 3 days since it snowed. The roof's had time to dry on the south-facing side. She was already moving to the door, not to open it, to listen to what was outside it. They're going to burn us out or wait for us to run. Dell looked at the trapdoor. No, she said. If the floor catches, the cellar isn't safe. There's no other exit. He knew that. He was looking at it anyway, the way people look at inadequate options when there are no adequate ones. The smoke smell was getting stronger. She heard it now, a soft crackling that didn't belong to anything inside the cabin. Whatever they'd thrown had caught on the dry side shingles and was working its way toward the peak. How long? Dell asked. She thought about the roof's construction. Cole had built it well. Tight-fitted boards under the shingles, nothing flimsy. 20 minutes before it comes through, she said. Maybe more, maybe less. Then we go out. Then we go out, she agreed. Not the front, the back. They moved to the rear door, the small, low one she'd used before to get to the rock face. She went first, Dell behind her, and the cold took the breath right out of her. The smoke was visible now above the roofline, a dirty smear against the night sky, catching the orange light of what was burning. She counted the men she could see from the back corner of the cabin. 2 in the clearing to the west near the barn. 1 at the far tree line. She caught him when he moved, a dark shape repositioning. They'd spread out, covering the exits. Standard enough if you expected panicked people running blind. She wasn't panicked, and she wasn't going to run blind. She put her lips close to Dell's ear. Can you hit that man at the tree line? He looked. Maybe. It's dark. I need him not moving for about 30 seconds. Dell looked at her sideways. You're going up the rock again. From up there I can see all 3 of them. From down here I can only see 2. Your hand. She held up her right hand. She'd kept it wrapped and she'd used it carefully over the past days. It hurt. It was stiff in the cold. It works well enough. Dell looked at the rock face rising behind the cabin. I'll give you 30 seconds. After that, I'm drawing fire to keep their attention. Don't get shot. Wasn't planning on it. She went up the rock. It was harder this time than the first. Her hand, the dark, the knowledge of what was happening to the cabin below her. She didn't let herself look at the fire. She kept her eyes on the rock in front of her face, and her hands in the holds she'd already used once, and she climbed. The rifle was slung across her back, and it caught on her twice, and she had to stop and reseat it without letting go of the rock. She reached the shelf, looked down. The clearing was laid out below her, and now she could see them properly. 6 men, not 3. They'd brought 6. 2 near the barn. 1 at the north tree line, 1 at the south, almost directly below her position. 1 she hadn't seen before, near the trailhead, covering their approach. And in the middle of the clearing, standing apart from the rest with the deliberate stillness of a man who doesn't need to look busy to be in charge. Arthur Kane. He was here himself. She shouldn't have been surprised. She'd told Dell he'd come eventually, and yet seeing him standing there in his good coat in the clearing of Coles Mountain, 70 feet below her, made something run cold through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd come to make sure it was finished. She heard Dell's pistol below. 1 shot, then another, and the man at the north tree line moved fast and fired back, and the clearing went briefly loud and then settled back into its tense quiet. Kane didn't flinch at the shots. He turned his head toward the direction Dell's fire had come from, and she could see, even at this distance and in this light, the quality of his stillness. He was a man who'd made decisions that got people killed and had never lost sleep over it. That particular stillness was the thing that finally made her cold rage go clear and specific and useful. She settled the rifle. The wind was down tonight. That was one thing in her favor. The air was brutal cold, but it was still. No gusts to compensate for. And the snowstorm from 3 days ago had left the world with a strange reflective clarity, the white ground catching whatever light existed and giving it back. She watched Kane. He turned to say something to the man nearest him. Walt Pruitt, she saw now, Walt Pruitt again like a bad coin, and gestured toward the cabin. He was directing something, probably calling for more fire, more pressure, or for men to breach the rear door before whoever was inside could use it. She shifted her aim. She wasn't going to shoot Arthur Kane. Not because she didn't want to, not because some part of her didn't think the world would be cleaner for it, but because a dead man could not testify against himself, could not produce the evidence that would clear her name, could not be hauled before a federal court to account for what he'd done to 6 miners and their families and 1 widow he'd helped drive into a mountain winter. A dead man was just a dead man, and she needed Arthur Kane to be something more complicated and more useful than that. What she was going to do was make him understand that he was not in control of this situation. She moved her aim to the man at the south edge of the clearing, the one she could see clearly, the one covering that angle. She had maybe 4 seconds before Kane's direction reached the men and they moved on the cabin. She fired. The man at the south went down. Not killed, she'd aimed for his leg. A difficult shot that she hit because she was close enough and the conditions were finally on her side. He went down hard in the snow and stayed down, making noise, and the clearing erupted. Men moved. 2 of them toward their fallen companion, which was instinct overriding training. Kane shouted something. Walt Pruitt spun in a full circle looking for the shooter, which would have been almost funny in other circumstances. She was already moving the rifle. She put the next shot into the snow directly in front of Kane, close enough that he felt it, close enough that it scattered snow onto his boots, and she followed it with her voice, which she had to raise to clear the distance, but which came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Arthur Kane," she called down. "That was a warning. The next one isn't." The clearing went very still. Kane looked up. He couldn't see her. She was in shadow on the rock shelf, the snowstorm clarity working in her favor now, giving her enough ambient light to see without being visible herself. She knew he couldn't find her position by the muzzle flash alone. "Mrs. Harper." His voice carried well, a politician's voice, trained to fill spaces. "You're burning your shelter down." "You're burning it," she said. "That's a distinction that matters. Come down from wherever you are," he said. "You and Rourke both. Nobody else needs to get hurt tonight." "Del Rourke is going to testify before a federal marshal," she said. "That's already in motion. Your men rode all this way for nothing." A pause. She watched him process that, watched the stillness become a different kind of stillness. "You're bluffing," he said. "Cole Mercer left for Halford 3 days ago." Another pause. Longer. "Mercer could have an accident in the mountains," Kane said. "It happens." "It does," she agreed, "but you'd need to know where he was to arrange it, and you don't." She kept the rifle on him. "How many more of your men do you want down tonight, Arthur? Because I can see all of you from up here, and you can't see me at all." Walt Pruitt said something she couldn't hear. Kane raised a hand and Walt went quiet, which told her something about the hierarchy. Even now, even out here, it was Kane's hand that stopped the room. "What do you want?" Kane said. His voice had shifted. Not softer, not more reasonable, but different, the way a man's voice gets when he's moved from confident to calculating. "I want you to call your men back," she said, "and I want you to still be on this mountain when Cole gets back with the marshal." He actually laughed. "You think I'm going to stand here and wait to be arrested?" "I think you're going to do whatever gets the most men off this mountain alive tonight," she said, "including yourself." The man she'd shot in the leg was being helped to a sitting position by 2 of the others. He was conscious, vocal about his pain, not dying. She'd measured that shot carefully. Kane stood in the middle of the clearing in his good coat and looked up at the darkness where she was, and she could feel, even from 40 feet, the process of his thinking. She'd made him into something he hadn't expected to be tonight, which was a man without good options. "The cabin's burning," he said. "Not a threat this time, just a fact." "Yes," she said. "It is." And it was. She could smell it stronger now and see the glow from around the north edge of the cabin roof, and she felt it like something physical, a grief she didn't have time for. "Your people did that. Come down," he said, a different tone now. "Come down and we can talk about how this goes. Your name, your husband's name, I can fix that. I have the authority in Black Ridge to—" "You have no authority here," she said. "You're standing on Cole Mercer's mountain with a burning cabin behind you and a rifle on your chest from somewhere you can't find. You don't have authority, you have a problem." She heard it then, coming from the north trail. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. Coming fast down from the pass, and she felt a surge of something that she was not going to call relief yet because it wasn't over. She held it at bay and kept the rifle on Kane and listened to the sound get louder. Kane heard it too. She saw him turn toward the north trail, and the particular quality of his stillness broke apart. Cole came out of the tree line first. The gray horse recovered somehow, or this was another horse she couldn't tell in the dark, moving fast across the upper edge of the clearing. Behind him, 3 other riders, and one of them was in a coat she didn't recognize, heavy and official-looking, a badge catching the light for just a moment as he moved. The marshal. Cole had made it. 4 days, not 5. What happened next was not orderly. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, because chaos was what it was, and she'd spent enough of her life having things misrepresented to her that she wanted to see things plainly when she could. Kane's men did not simply surrender. 2 of them ran immediately, driving for the south tree line. One got through, one didn't, caught by the marshal's deputies who'd fanned out faster than she'd tracked. Walt Pruitt threw his rifle down and put his hands up before anyone told him to, which was either the most sensible thing he'd ever done or the most cowardly, depending on how you wanted to look at it. Kane himself stood still until the very last moment. She watched him from the shelf, watched him assess the horsemen coming across the clearing, count them, measure the distance between himself and the tree line, and find it insufficient. She watched him make the decision. Not surrender, not yet, but the preliminary to it. The moment when a man admits to himself that the thing he was building has come down. He looked up at the rock shelf one more time. She still had the rifle on him. Cole had dismounted and was moving across the clearing toward the cabin, and he looked up and saw her on the shelf and stopped. Just stopped, for one moment, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't fully read at this distance and in this light, but which contained something she understood. She'd been here. She'd held the cabin, or what was left of it, and she was still here. She climbed down from the shelf. Her hand was bleeding again, the cut having reopened somewhere in the second climb. Her arms were shaking, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the cold and the exertion and the accumulated weight of 3 days of being the only thing standing between Del Rourke and the men who wanted him dead. She climbed down and came around the north corner of the cabin and walked into the clearing. The roof was burning in earnest now. The north face of it, a section of shingles maybe 8 feet across, orange in the dark. It wasn't lost yet. The fire hadn't come through to the inside yet. If they moved fast, if they had enough water and enough people, Cole was already organizing it. He had 2 of the marshal's deputies with buckets from the water barrel they'd passed on the trail, and he was on the cabin roof somehow. She didn't ask how he'd gotten up there in the dark, throwing snow from the higher sections down onto the fire with his hands when the buckets ran out. Del came out of the rear door and stood in the clearing and blinked at the organized chaos around him with the expression of a man who'd spent 3 days in a cellar and a cabin and had emerged to find the world rearranged. The marshal, a compact man in his 40s named Briggs, she'd learn later, with a careful face and very precise way of speaking, came to her directly. He had a deputy on each side of him, and Kane was behind him with his hands being held, not yet in irons, but close enough. "You're Evelyn Harper," Briggs said. "Yes." "Mercer told me what you were holding up here." He glanced at the burning roof, then back at her. "He wasn't wrong about you." She looked at him. "You have Del Rourke," she said. "He'll testify to everything. He has dates, names, amounts. He knows where the stolen money is." She looked past Briggs at Arthur Kane. All of it connects back to him. Kane's face was doing nothing now. It had gone flat and careful, the face of a man who'd stopped performing and was conserving energy for whatever came next. She'd seen that face before on Thomas, in the last weeks of his life when he'd understood that the consequences of what he'd done were arriving, and there was nothing left to do but wait for them. "Mrs. Harper," Kane said. She looked at him. "I underestimated you," he said. Just that. Not an apology, not a plea. An admission, as if he were noting a tactical error for future reference. "Yes," she said. "You did." She turned away from him. The fire on the roof hissed as the next bucket hit it, and then Cole's voice from above, calling down about the section near the chimney, and Del was already hauling water, and the clearing was full of movement and cold breath, and horses and men doing the work of endings and beginnings simultaneously. Her hand hurt. Her arms hurt. She was so tired that the world had taken on a slightly unreal quality, the way exhaustion eventually blurs the line between what's happening and what's already become memory. But the cabin was still standing, most of it anyway. And Arthur Kane was standing in his good coat with his hands held and his jurisdiction dissolved around him, and somewhere in a mine shaft 6 miles east of where they stood, there was money that belonged to families who'd gone without it for too long. She stood in the middle of the clearing and she let herself feel it. Not triumph, nothing so clean as that, just the specific quiet that comes when the thing you've been braced against finally stops pushing. Cole came down from the roof. He landed heavy and moved to her and looked her over the way he looked at everything. Direct, no performance to it. "Your hand," he said. "I know. We need to wrap that properly. I know that too." He looked at her face. Whatever he found there, he held his gaze on it for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "The marshal got here faster than I expected," she said. "I moved fast," Cole said. "The pass was bad," he said. "I moved fast anyway." She looked at him. This man who'd ridden into Black Ridge and looked at a crowd and made a decision, who'd built a cabin against a rock face in the mountains and stocked it for two and lived alone with the spare plate anyway, who'd come back from Halford faster than the conditions warranted because there were people here waiting for him. "The roof," she said. "How bad?" He glanced back up at it. The fire was out, or mostly out, the deputies still working the last stubborn edges of it. "Fixable," he said. "It'll take work. A few days at least before it's weather-tight again." "I can help with that," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Simply, clearly, without making it into something larger than it was. Just a fact stated plainly. "So I can help with the roof." Something moved through Cole Mercer's face, slow and careful, like light coming back into a space that had been dark for a long time. He nodded. Marshal Briggs was speaking to Dell across the clearing. Both of them bent over something. Papers Dell had produced from somewhere. Documents he'd been carrying. The evidence that would begin the unraveling of everything Arthur Kane had built. Walt Pruitt was sitting in the snow with his hands tied and the expression of a man reconsidering his life's associations. Two deputies were leading the remaining horses toward the barn. The mountain was quiet around all of it, the way mountains are, utterly indifferent to the human chaos in their clearings, patient in the way that only things measured in centuries can be patient. Evelyn Harper stood in the snow in a burned clearing outside a cabin that was going to need a new section of roof with a cut hand and a borrowed rifle and 3 days of fear and cold working their way out of her shoulders, and she looked up at the rock shelf above the north wall, where she'd climbed twice in the dark, and she thought, "You're still here. Not triumphant, not transformed. Just still here," which was the one thing they'd all been trying to prevent, and she had not allowed it, and that was enough for tonight. That was more than enough. The roof took 11 days to fix. That was longer than Cole had estimated, which he acknowledged without making excuses for. The fire damage had gone deeper into the underlying boards than the surface suggested, and there was a section near the chimney that had to be entirely replaced rather than patched. He was particular about it in a way that she initially read as perfectionism and came to understand as something else. A man repairing damage done to something he'd built with his own hands was not the same as a man doing a job. It was closer to personal. She helped. She'd said she would, and she meant it. And the work itself, carrying boards, holding things in place while he nailed them, mixing the sealant for the seams, was the kind that asked enough from your body to quiet your mind, which was what she needed in those first days after everything had come apart and begun, slowly, to reassemble into something new. Marshal Briggs had taken Arthur Kane and the surviving members of his crew down the mountain 2 days after the night of the fire. Walt Pruitt had gone with them, his hands in irons, his face wearing the specific expression of a young man who'd mistaken proximity to power for power itself, and was only now understanding the distinction. Del Rourke had gone too, not in irons but in Briggs's custody, a cooperative witness rather than a prisoner, which was the arrangement Cole had negotiated in Halford before he'd ridden back. Before Del left, he'd stood in the clearing with his coat buttoned and his breath making clouds in the cold morning air, and he'd looked at Evelyn with the direct, slightly uncomfortable gaze of a man trying to say something he didn't have sufficient practice saying. "I meant what I told you," he said, "about the testimony, about your husband's name." "I know you did," she said. "It's going to take some time. Federal proceedings." "Del." She looked at him steadily. "I've waited this long. I can wait for the legal process to do what it does." He nodded. Then he said, "You're going to be all right up here?" She glanced back at the cabin, at Cole on the roof already, starting the first assessment of what needed doing, moving across the burned section with the careful deliberation that was entirely him. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." Del Rourke rode down the mountain with the marshal and his deputies in the wreckage of Arthur Kane's operation, and Evelyn watched them go from the clearing until the trail bent north through the pines and took them out of sight. Then she went inside and made coffee and carried a cup up to Cole on the roof, which required a certain amount of creative climbing that she managed without asking for help. And he took the cup and drank from it without breaking his examination of the damage. And that was the beginning of the 11 days. The work was good for both of them in ways that were hard to articulate and probably didn't need to be. They moved through the days with the cabin between them as a shared project, which was different from the way it had been before. Before, it had been his place, and she was in it. Now there was a slight but real shift, something that had to do with what she'd done while he was gone, what she'd held and protected, and what he'd ridden 4 days through a hard mountain pass to do. The cabin had earned a different meaning, and they both knew it. They didn't talk about it directly. That wasn't how either of them were built. On the 6th day of the repairs, she was up on the roof beside him, holding a board in place against the new framing while he drove nails, and she said, without planning to, "Tell me about Garrett." Cole's hammer paused. "The man you mentioned," she said. "Who worked for you? Who went down to town and didn't come back?" He drove 2 more nails before he answered. "He was from Tennessee," Cole said. "Came out west about the same time I did. We worked a season together further north before I found this place. When I settled here, he came up to help me build the main structure." He looked along the roof line. "He stayed after that. Suited him up here." "What was he like?" "Talked too much," Cole said, and something moved briefly through his face that was the closest thing to fawn she'd seen on it. "Never stopped. Could build anything, fix anything, had an opinion about everything, whether he knew enough about it to have one or not." He paused. "He was good company." She held the board and let the silence sit where it needed to. "When he didn't come back," Cole said, "I went down, asked questions. Harlan Greer told me Garrett had taken up with a woman in the next valley and moved on, showed me a note." He set the hammer down. "The note wasn't Garrett's writing. I'd seen Garrett's writing. It wasn't his. You knew then." "I knew, but you couldn't prove it." "No." He picked the hammer back up. "Kane had his fingers in everything in Black Ridge by that point. The sheriff, the council, the records. If I made accusations without proof, I'd have been run out of town or worse, and there'd be nobody watching from up here." He looked at her. "So I waited." 2 years, she said. 2 years, he agreed. "And then Del Rourke showed up at my door in November with a story and a dead brother and enough information to finally do something with." She thought about that. 2 years of living with the knowledge of what had happened to Garrett, keeping it close, not letting it become something that broke him. She thought about the spare plate in the cabinet that she'd noticed on her first night here, which she now understood was not for a woman who'd never come, but for a man who was gone. "The plate," she said. Cole looked at her. "In the cabinet, the spare plate, cup, those were his." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. She nodded and said nothing else about it. Some things didn't need to be expanded on. He'd kept the plate because getting rid of it would have been an admission that Garrett wasn't coming back, and there was something in that she understood completely. The way you hold on to a small object, not because it changes anything, but because some losses are too blunt to confront all at once. The 11th day they set the last section of new shingles and sealed the seams, and Cole came down the ladder and stood back and looked at it. The new section was visibly different from the old, lighter wood, the seams too clean, and it would stay that way for a year or two until the weather worked it into something closer to matching. It would never be exactly the same as before the fire, and they both knew that, and it didn't seem to trouble him. "It'll hold," he said. "It'll hold," she agreed. They stood in the clearing in the sharp winter light and looked at what they'd done, and the mountain was quiet around them, the way it had been that first night she'd arrived. That particular quality of silence that was not empty but full of things too large and too patient to bother with noise. The letter from Marshal Briggs arrived in February, carried up by a rider from Black Ridge, who had the uncomfortable expression of a man who hadn't wanted this errand and had done it anyway. She read it at the table while Cole stood by the window. Arthur Kane had been formally charged with conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to the robbery of the mining company payroll. 3 other members of the Black Ridge Council had been implicated in the investigation, not in the robbery itself, but in the cover-up, which Briggs's letter explained in the careful language of a man who'd seen a lot of corruption and had learned to be precise about what he could and couldn't prove. The stolen money had been recovered from the mine shaft east of the cabin, exactly where Del had said it would be. It was being held in federal custody pending the distribution to the men who'd been robbed. Thomas Harper's role in the robbery had been formally reclassified in the federal record, from organizer to recruited participant, based on Del Rourke's testimony and corroborating documents. The letter was careful to note that this didn't expunge Thomas's actions, only contextualized them. Briggs was precise about what the law could and couldn't do with the dead. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting that was slightly different from the body, a more personal edition, Briggs had written, "The woman you left on that mountain is something else. You did right by her, Mercer." She folded the letter. "Well," she said. Cole turned from the window. She held the letter out. He came and took it and read it and set it on the table. "Your name's clear," he said. "Clear," she corrected, because she was done pretending that things were more resolved than they were. Thomas's name would always carry what it carried. Her association with it would always be a fact that certain people in certain places would use a certain way. The law couldn't fix that. What it could do was establish the record, and the record was now established. "Clearer," Cole agreed. She looked at the letter on the table. Del held up his end. "He's a better man than his brother," Cole said. "Probably knew it for years and didn't know what to do with that." She thought about Del in the cellar, Del helping fix the hinge, Del on the other side of the table talking about his mother dying when he was 8. People were not simple, and she'd stopped expecting them to be. "What happens to him?" she asked. Briggs said reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. "He'll do time, but not much." Cole picked up his coffee. "He knew that going in. He said it was fair." She nodded. Outside the window, the February light was starting its long, slow shift towards spring. Not warm yet, nothing like warm, but different from the brutal flat gray of January. The sun was taking longer to drop. The shadows in the clearing had a slightly less defeated quality to them. She'd lived on this mountain long enough now to read those changes, to feel them as something real and not just cosmetic. A week after Briggs's letter came, she got another one. This one was from Black Ridge, from Clara Ames at the boarding house, who'd slipped her a meal once back in October and whose handwriting turned out to be small and careful and earnest. Clara wrote that the town had been, her word, shaken by the revelations about Kane and the council, that Harlan Greer had closed his store for 2 days, and when he'd reopened, he'd been noticeably quieter about everything, which Clara seemed to consider appropriate, that the 2 Pruitt brothers had left Black Ridge entirely, the older one heading north, Walt presumably heading toward whatever legal accounting was waiting for him, that there was talk of a new council and new elections, that people were saying Evelyn Harper's name differently now, which was not the same as saying it correctly, but was at least a movement in that direction. At the end of the letter, Clara wrote, "I don't know if you'll ever come back here. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, but if you do, come find me first. I kept one of your hairpins. Found it on the street the day you left. I thought someone should keep it safe until it could be returned." Evelyn sat with that letter for a long time. She'd thought about Black Ridge differently since the night of the fire, since standing in the clearing with the rifle and watching Arthur Kane's silver hair catch the firelight. She'd thought about it the way you think about a place that hurt you, which is to say, imprecisely, with a mixture of anger and clarity that never quite resolved into one thing. The town had not been purely evil. It had been what most places were, a collection of people making the choices that felt safe to them, which in a place like Black Ridge under a man like Kane had meant doing nothing while a widow got driven into the mountains. That was not the same as actively wanting her dead, though the outcome had been heading there. It was smaller than that and in some ways worse, indifference dressed up as principle. She wasn't sure she wanted to go back. She was sure she no longer needed to. That distinction felt important. Cole came in from the barn one afternoon in late February to find her at the table with both letters in front of her and a piece of paper she'd been writing on. He looked at the paper without reading it. He had a habit of not reading things that were plainly personal unless invited to, and started taking off his coat. "I'm writing back to Clara," she said. "Good," he said. "And I think—" She stopped, chose the words. "I think in the spring I might go down. Not to stay, just to—" She paused again. "There are 6 families who got their money back. I'd like to know if they're all right." Cole hung his coat and looked at her. "And I think I'd like to walk through Black Ridge once," she said. "On my own terms. Not running from anything. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll go with you if you want." "I know you will," she said. "I'll let you know." He nodded and went to the stove, and that was the end of that conversation, which was exactly the right length for it. She wrote back to Clara. She wrote that she was well. She wrote that she didn't know about coming back to Black Ridge yet, but she thought maybe spring. She wrote, "Thank you for keeping the hairpin. I didn't know anyone noticed me leave." She sealed it and set it aside to go down with the next rider. Then she went to the window and looked out at the clearing, the repaired cabin roof with its slightly lighter section still visible, the barn, the dark wall of pines at the edge. The tracks she'd made walking out to the woodshed that morning were still clear in the snow, alongside Cole's from his earlier trip to the barn. Two sets of tracks going different directions for different reasons, both coming back. She thought about what the mountain had taught her, which was not anything she could have learned in a schoolroom or a marriage or a town that needed her to be one thing consistently. It had taught her the specific arithmetic of survival, not endurance as abstraction, not strength as performance, but the actual daily accounting of what you had and what you needed and what you were willing to do with the gap between them. She was worse at pretending now. She was better at most other things. She thought about trust, about how she'd stood at the bottom of a mountain in December with 2 cents and a pack and a choice between walking into a closed pass or getting on a stranger's horse, and she'd made a decision based on incomplete information and a reading of a man's face and the fact that her alternatives were non-existent. She thought about how that was also, essentially, what Cole had done when he'd ridden into Black Ridge that morning. Two people trusting an imperfect read of a situation they couldn't fully see, and being right enough to still be here. She thought about Thomas, not often now, but still. She thought about the version of him she'd loved and the version of him that had been real, and the distance between those two things, and she'd stopped trying to resolve that distance into something cleaner. He had been both, a man worth loving and a man who'd made ruinous choices, and she had been a woman who couldn't see through the one to find the other, and that was a complicated truth that was simply going to stay complicated. She'd stopped waiting for it to resolve. The days lengthened slowly the way they do at altitude, so gradually you could miss it if you weren't paying attention. But she was paying attention now. She noticed things. The light coming differently through the east window by the end of March. The first sounds from the creek below the cabin, ice cracking, water starting to move underneath. The way the horses in the barn became slightly more restless, picking up something in the air that hadn't been there a month ago. One evening in early April, she and Cole were on the porch. He'd built the porch to face the clearing and the long view south, where on clear days you could see down 3 ridges to the distant impression of the valley where Black Ridge sat. The sky was doing something complicated with color in the west. Not the fierce colors of a cold winter sunset, but something softer, more layered, the kind of sky that looked like it was trying a few things out. "You could have gone back," Cole said. She looked at him. "Briggs's letter. Your name cleared, or clear, as you said. You could have gone back to Black Ridge. Tried to restart something there." She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think about things up here. Not what she was supposed to feel, or what would sound right, but what was actually true. "No," she said. "I couldn't. Because of them. Because of me," she said. "I'm not the same person they threw out in December. That woman could have lived in Black Ridge. She'd been doing it, barely, but she'd been doing it. I don't fit back into that shape anymore." She looked at the view. "That's not a complaint." Cole was quiet. "What about you?" she said. "You could have gone down too, after Kane was taken. You'd done what you set out to do for Garrett. You didn't have to stay on the mountain." "No," he said. "So why did you?" He looked at the western sky doing its complicated thing. "Because it's mine," he said. "Because I built it, and I know it, and there's nowhere else I'd rather be." He paused. "And because the company got better." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the sky, and his profile in the fading light was the same as it always was. The broken once nose, the jaw, the particular quality of stillness that she'd first read as distance and had come to understand was just the way he inhabited himself. Fully, without apology, without performance. "The company got better," she repeated. "Yeah." She turned back to the view. The last of the color was going out of the sky, softening into the deep blue that came before full dark. Below them, 3 ridges away, The lights of Black Ridge would be coming on, small and distant, someone else's world now. "Cole," she said. "Yeah. Thank you for riding into town that day." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd have figured something out." "Maybe," she said, "but you made it faster." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one. "You made it faster too," he said, "on that rock shelf, with 6 men in the clearing." She thought about that. The cold rock under her hands, the bleeding cut, the rifle. Arthur Kane standing below her with his good coat and his dissolving certainty. She thought about the moment she'd decided to fire, the specific clarity of it, the way fear had sharpened down to a single functional point. "I was scared," she said, "up on that shelf. I know." "How do you know?" "Because you're not an idiot," he said. "Scared was the right thing to be." She laughed, actually laughed, which still surprised her when it happened, that her body remembered how to do it and produced it without her having to plan for it. The dark came down fully. The stars at elevation were always startling, more and brighter than anywhere she'd been, the sky up here having a clarity that felt almost confrontational. She'd gotten used to it. She'd gotten used to a lot of things she would not have predicted last December. She thought about the woman who'd walked through Black Ridge with her bundle, 2 cents, the eyes of people who'd decided she was finished on her back. She thought about what that woman had not known, that the mountain was there, that the man was there, that something was waiting that was not punishment but not rescue either, just possibility, which was all anything ever was. The world did not balance its books in any satisfying way. She knew that. 6 men had gotten their money back, but they didn't get back the winter they'd spent without it. Garrett was still gone, and Dell would do time, and Thomas was still dead, and she would carry what she carried about her marriage for the rest of her life. Arthur Kane would stand trial, but the damage he'd done was already done, and the legal process would not repair all of it, only account for it. None of that resolved. It just became part of the shape of things. What remained, after the accounting, was this: a repaired roof that showed where the fire had been, a spare plate in the cabinet that she no longer moved around but no longer avoided either, a letter from Clara Ames with a hairpin in it, waiting for spring, 2 sets of tracks in the last of the snow, going different directions, both coming back. What remained was the mountain in April, beginning its slow return to something livable, and the long view south, and the stars doing what they always did up here, being more than you expected, more than the dark deserved, indifferent and extraordinary and entirely unconcerned with whether anyone was looking. She was looking. That felt like enough. That felt, after everything, like more than enough.